Hello, this is Professor Bustillo-Booth. This is part 2 of our weeks 5 through 6 wrap-up, where I will focus in on organizational culture, structure, and communication. In this video, I will go over the main concepts and main takeaways of Chapter 7, Organization, Teamwork, and Communication from the book Business by Furl, Hurt, and Furl. I will also bring in other concepts that are not from that book to try to bring this all together. Let's begin with some definitions. As you might suspect, organizational culture are those shared norms, the values, the beliefs, rules, models of behavior, that sort of thing, that make up an organization's social and psychological environment. And so the way it behaves and the way it thinks. Structure, then, is the arrangement or relationship of positions within that organization. And later on, I will go over samples of what structures might look like. And communication is the means of connecting and transferring information, typically between people and places. And the idea of teamwork is the combined effort of a group of people. Now, I used to be an English teacher, and I like going back to understand the meaning of words and its origins, so it's etymology. And I think it's appropriate here. Culture comes from the mid-15th century, meaning tilling of the land, right? And then the Middle French word culture and the Latin word cultura meant cultivation through education. And I want you to think of education here in the sense of how people come to know a thing, all right? And then in the mid-1800s, this meant collective customs and achievements of a people. And today, we really understand this word to mean shared norms, beliefs, values, and behaviors that lead to group identity. And so please keep that word in mind as we think about culture and how it comes to inform structure in an organization. And so every single organization has a culture, and it exists whether it was done so intentionally by the founders or its leaders, or accidentally by the founders or its leaders. Either way, every organization has a culture. And that it informs the organizational structure. And so its internal culture, in this sense, reflects, its performance and the way it communicates. And the way it communicates and performs has a lot to do with how that organization then orients itself to external stakeholders. Let's discuss for a moment as far as organizations are concerned, where culture really begins and its drivers. And I want you to think of it in terms of who gave the organization birth, right? And so once upon a time, there were owners or founders, and they were its leaders. Sometimes that's one person, and sometimes it's more. And sometimes it gets introduced, it being the organization, gets introduced into the world say as a sole proprietor. There was just a person who wanted to build widgets or something. And then over time it got bigger, right? But even in either case, the owner, the founder, the leaders had values, and they had beliefs and philosophies and models of behavior, and it informed the development of the organization's mission. And so then it manifested itself in organizational, social, and formal structures, because the mission encapsulates values, beliefs, and philosophies. And as people are inducted into the business or the organization, they become educated into what the values, beliefs, and philosophies are of that organization. And so there's a constant tilling of the land by cultivating the people who come into it and become educated about what this organization is about, what its culture is, what its identity is. But that's not the only thing that can drive its culture or ultimately the kind of structure it then embodies. When an organization or firm enters a market, it sort of has to pay attention to what that market space is like, whether it's saturated with many competitors or whether it's entering a new market. If it's saturated and has many competitors, the culture or the structure is largely defined by sort of the existence of those competing businesses. If it's a new market space, then there's a lot of room to sort of create new cultural norms and structural, forms. And also the rate of change within that market space will largely inform and influence the kind of structure the organization ultimately adopts or changes into. Because sometimes an organization can start out as a particular kind of structure, but because there are disruptions within the market space, it needs to be able to respond to the speed of innovation. And so if it were a hierarchical organization with many layers, it maybe have to become flat so that it can respond to market threats. And we'll go over that here in a little bit. So let's talk about how an organization can develop sort of from its simplest form. So let's imagine an owner who basically who does everything. This is a completely new business. And let's say it's lucky enough to grow and in need of sales staff and a webmaster. And so the manager then, or managers, if it were a partnership, needs to identify activities to meet objectives. And so it assigns internal tasks. You sales staff, you do these things, and you webmaster, you're responsible for these things. And as an owner, I'm still making decisions from the top. Let's say that it continues to grow, and so it now needs to have a sales manager, right? So the owner is not just overseeing a sales staff, but it says, we're growing so fast, we need to have a sales manager to oversee the sales staff. And the webmaster now has to have IT people in order to address the complexity of the organization. And instead of doing accounting by ourselves, we're now going to hire an accountant. And since we have a lot of accounts, we need to also have accounts associates to deal with that complexity. And it's a good thing because the organization is growing. So as you can see here, a structure then develops. And the structure can have different forms. And one form is a tall organization and a narrow span. And so a tall organization has many layers, like you see here, and a narrow span, meaning the decision making is really more at the top. Or it can have more of a flatter structure and a wider span, meaning there are not as many layers, but there are many functions or different departments within that organization. And in the first example here, with a tall organization, it is more your classic pyramid structure where a decision making is centralized. More decisions are made at the top, whereas in a flat organization, what we call that decentralized, right? And another way to look at that is in a tall organization, the decision making again is at the top, and at the lower levels, the execution or layers are responsible for implementing the decisions that were made at the top. And so that typically happens, this kind of structure typically happens when they're high-risk decision-making, where the lower level managers are not that highly skilled, and so the decision-making has to occur at the top, and the lower levels are just basically implementing decisions being made. And this kind of structure does result in implementation taking longer, specifically because there are more layers, and then they are slower to respond to changes. In a flat organization, the decision making is made by delegation, so it's diffused across the different departments or divisions, right? And this particular kind of organization is typically best when the environment is unpredictable and it is designed to be nimble in the face of rapid change. So, for example, right now, like if you've heard of Zappos, Zappos is a very flat organization. Started out with selling shoes. They may sell many other things by now, but because it is in a, it's it's in a very saturated market space, and it entered it with an innovative business model. And in order to, have it's an e-commerce, and in order for it to be a disruptive business model, it needed to have a flat organization where its employees are empowered to fix problems at the front lines, so it doesn't have to call, employees on the phone taking orders don't actually have to go and consult with their managers to solve a problem. They are empowered to do so. And in that case, they become very highly skilled because they have to problem solve on the spot. And so that's a very flat organization. Okay, and no matter what the structure is, there are different kinds of task assignments, and one of which is this idea of specialization. And just like it sounds, people are very specialized because they're division of labor into small specific tasks. And the Ford assembly line may come to mind when we talk about specialization. Today we still have specialization where people are really sort of responsible for very specific tasks. And those are generally embraced because they're very efficient and they minimize waste. You're doing the same thing over and over and over again. And so you become very, very good at doing that one thing. Okay, and the negative aspect of that is that by doing that one thing, employees can become very bored and unmotivated, and they will move on to other things, to other jobs. And because it's a repetitive type of, some jobs are very repetitive, it can also result in injuries. Another task assignment is that of departmentalization, or the grouping of jobs into working units, like marketing, finance, accounting, product development, that sort of thing. And the pluses of that is that because there are folks working together around particular departments, they get very good at that. They get very good at marketing, they're very good at finance and so on. But a negative aspect of that is because they become isolated. So marketing has its own language, its own schedule, or finance its own language and its own schedule and ways of doing something, and they can become siloed. So when you hear people talk about silos, that's what they're talking about, that they're not really talking to each other, and they may not be leveraging each other's knowledge in order to meet organizational objectives. So that can be a negative. To address the weaknesses of specialization and departmentalization, this structure called a matrix has been developed. It is modeled after project management, where there are teams from different units, right? So there will be teams, and so in this case there are working groups or working teams that basically cross-pollinate. They come together and intersect to inform their tasks. So unit specialists come together to discuss how it is that they're doing their work, what's guiding their work, and then so that they can integrate their work and be informed. And so this used to be a temporary structure, and some organizations are adopting them now as the organizational structure to be more permanent. Okay, and so when an organization decides on what its structure will be, there are certain questions it asks, and there are many, many, many questions, and these are just sort of your general questions that you would ask, but one of which is to ask, what business are we really in? Okay, what is the nature of our market space, and what are our values, beliefs, and norms of behavior? So if we value collaboration, right, that and the need to be able to work quickly together, that might then result in a flat organization. And also another question might be, what are the capabilities of our managers? So if our managers do not have high skills, then a flat organization may set them up for failure. And so it needs to be a little bit more taller, an organization with a narrow span, and decision making be made more at the top levels, and then the lower levels are more responsible for executing the decisions that were made. Okay. And then ultimately this question about what are the pluses and minuses of different structures given our business model. And when people talk about business model is this idea of how you make a buck, right? How a business actually becomes profitable. And that's important to understand because certain structures in a particular market space may require different kinds of structures in order to be competitive so they can make money. So those are important questions to ask. Now, no matter what kind of organizational structure what one might be in, there are typically groups and or teams. And so let's distinguish the two of them. Okay, so groups are two or more individuals who communicate and share common identity and have a common goal, but they don't necessarily produce a product together. Okay, they come together to talk and discuss, that sort of thing. And then teams are small groups of group of people who have complementary skills, and they come together with a purpose to deliver a product or a set of products, and they hold each other accountable. Okay, and the distinguishing feature between these two is in the manner in which they execute, what it is they do. And so let's look at a table that was provided to you in your book. And it's a good one. And if you look very closely here, you'll find what the distinguishing factors are between what a working group is and what a team might be. And so, for example, in a working group, there is typically a focused leader. And in a team, there could be shared leadership roles. And so the team lead can rotate, for example. And that in a working group, there are individual accountability. In a team, there's individual and group accountability. And then I won't go through each one of these, but just sort of note its major aspects. And that is, for example, in a working group, they can create individual products. So they come together and they sort of discuss what each member has done. But a team comes together to produce a collective work, right? A collective work. And that a working group can discuss, decide, and delegate what may, tasks. But a team actually, yes, they discuss and they do decide, but they work together in order to produce a collective product. So that's really a distinguishing feature between working groups and teams. Now, there are team development stages, and you probably have been a part of a team and you've seen different stages of team development, and I'll just go over sort of its major aspects here. The first one is this stage called forming, and where teams come together and there's a lot of niceties. People say hello, they get to know each other, everything's well and good. And during this stage, the team really needs guidance. The roles are unclear, there are no processes yet, right? And then the work begins. And then there's storming. And members within that team will discover that they have very different, different members of the team may have different ideas about when things get done and how they get done, the quality of the work and so on. And then, it may not be clear who actually is responsible for what, and yet they have to produce something, right? And so it is marked by a degree of tension. It can go anywhere from category 1 to category 5, and some teams don't survive this stage. And but if they do survive it, because they've decided, we have to produce this work anyway, so let's come up with some processes, they'll establish some norms and decision making, and they'll clarify their goals, and that's called norming, right? And they'll produce their work. And some teams will sort of hobble along and they'll get some work done. Now, This is the holy grail stage, which is performing. And this is sort of the goal of teams, is to get to the point of just not norming, figuring out what it is you're supposed to do, but performing, where members of the team are committed to do the work, and they've come up with strategic performance so that they're efficient and effective. And if you may recall in the first video, effective is this idea of getting things done, and efficient is being able to do it with as little waste, to do it on time, on budget, that sort of thing. And that the team now is focused on continuous improvement because they're likely to produce another deliverable, another project. For all teams to be effective, there needs to be really good communication. So let's go back and take a look at the origin of the word communication to fully understand what it is really about. It comes to us from the late 14th century, from the old French word communication, and from the Latin word communicationem, to make common. Now, isn't that interesting? To make common. The verb form of it means to transfer, to communicate, to transfer, exchange of information. And the noun form, communication, understand to mean the means of connection between people and places. So this is the how we actually communicate. And this is really important. So when teams miscommunicate, mis meaning bad, wrong, divergent, or less, there is a mistransfer or a misexchange of information. A misconnection between people and places occur. And that's when miscommunication really occurs. You're sort of talking over each other's heads and nobody's really listening, and things get worse, right? Because folks are no longer connecting. And so here are some tips or prompts to help gain understanding, right? And these are the things that I highly recommend that you kind of include in your toolkit so that you can go beyond being frustrated into more a productive kind of discussion. And this does require humility, so that you have to kind of suspend your own judgments and your own sense of what may be upsetting you or misunderstanding, because there's a lot of things that may be going on and you might want to say a lot of things. But in this case, in order for teams or even an individual to transcend the moment, one needs to sort of take on this position of inquiry to find out what the heck is going on here, right? And so here are some questions that I'm going to share with you that have helped me, and invite you to take, you could pause the video and sort of take this down, because these are really important. And if you adopt this kind of questioning or inquiry, you actually become more effective as a team member, and you may also develop as a leader, okay? And so here are some questions. One of which is to say, tell me more about that. It signals to the other that you're interested, that you are concerned about what is being said, that you want to learn more. That is a place of humility. Another similar question is this one that goes something like, what about that specifically concerns you? Okay, because some folks may be saying something and you're still, talking over each other's heads, but they may not be saying something that really concerns them specifically. It may not even be about the organization or about the project, but about them. What about that specifically concerns you? It may be that the time frame in which a project is being done does not conform with, present obligations they may have, whether it be with another team or family, anything like that. But unless you ask, you're not going to find out. Okay. And believe it or not, there are certain, kind of ways we present problems just out of habit, right? But in order to understand what might be happening, we may have to phrase the problem differently. And so one way to ask that is to say, please describe the problem again in terms of how it is affecting specific stakeholders, including you, if relevant. It sort of stops the discussion and turns, kind of helps us see another perspective. And that's really important because it gets you unstuck. And being unstuck is really your goal so that you can move forward, right? And then there is this really wonderful way of asking questions. It's, it sounds kind of like you're going back to your, channeling your inner 3-year-old, but this is highly effective. And you do this respectfully, right? And you basically ask why 5 times. So if something is happening and we still don't really know if that's the problem, you ask why a second time, because the first why just gets to the first layer. And what we're really trying to do is go to the underlying, root cause. And research shows that if you ask why 5 times, both parties will actually gain better understanding. And then understand, oh, that's what's happening. And you may not be asking the same person this, the why. It could be that one in an organizational structure, you ask why from one particular, department. Then you go to another department, you ask why. And then another department, you ask why, and so on. Or the different layers of management or even staff. And you'll get a bigger picture of what actually might be happening. So you can have better understanding. And that's what you really want, is to have an understanding of what's happening. So keep these kinds of questions in mind, these 5 kinds of questions, so that you become more effective as a team member and as a leader. Now let's apply the concepts of culture, structure, and communication back to team development. So at the forming stage, one of the things that need to happen in order to have effective teams is the establishment of its own internal culture, right? In the form of a team charter. So in that charter, then the team does a brainstorming session on establishing what its values, its beliefs, and norms and behaviors are. And so that really is culture, okay? And then to clarify roles on who does what. And so in this discussion, the team will then come up with norms around decision-making processes, on how to, resolve conflicts, how to communicate and when, and who is responsible for what. That is really the beginning of a structure, right? So that when it goes inevitably into the storming stage, it can lean in on its culture and affirm or update process or norms in case they're not working, and so that then it can move into productive disagreement. And so again, each team will go through a storming stage. It's whether or not it will be a category 1 storm or a category 5 storm and not survive it. And so if they have not established a culture or a structure on how to deal with things, teams will tend to stay within the storming stage. But if they have successfully agreed upon a culture and structure, it can then move on to norming, okay, where it is using its norms in order to offer constructive support with each other, right, and develop what are called SMART goals. And if you remember in the first video, SMART goals are really specific, measurable, achievable, relevant to the mission, and time-bound. And it's far easier to come up with those SMART goals and deliver on those SMART goals if there is a culture that's established on how to work together and a structure in which to deliver that, right? And so then teams can do what's called checking the mileposts, so they can know, or at least understand, how far along they've gone on their project development so that they ultimately will deliver on their products. And then the holy grail of team development is attaining this stage called performing, where teams have backup plans because things don't always work out the way you think you'd like them to work, and that they're committed to continuous improvement. Not only because for the sake of continuous improvement, but because as a team they've taken pride in producing really high quality work. And then they are able then to celebrate small and big wins. And that happens because a culture has been established that within that group identity is this idea of working together, and working together through using its norms, and because it has a structure delivering that. And in teams, those structures are typically flat, right? Because they just generally are. That is because teams are made up of a few number of people, and it does not need a tall organizational structure, for example. And that because they have norms and established ways of communicating, they're able to continuously connect, right? And so this is very important to understand, that teams themselves are a manifestation of the very kinds of concepts that larger organizations need to develop in order to be effective. So what I'd like you to think about is that culture really is like the soul, right? So it has the values and the beliefs or the identity of a group, a team, or an organization, and that the structure is the arrangement of the positions. And so that's the body, how the parts work together in order for the work to animate itself and get done. And communication is the way in which minds connect, so that they actually are in continuous transferring and exchange of information, so they get things done. And it is through the alignment of these three concepts where organizations then are able to meet their goals. That brings us to the end of this video. I thank you very much for listening, and we'll talk with you again soon.